Mr. Bayer, part of your testimony was to the effect that the collective bargaining law has been in place for about 30 years.
Almost, yes.
And that your union, AFSCME, has been part of the negotiating process over those 30 years.
That's correct.
Now, I know that this would call upon you to do instant recall, which will be a little difficult. But over those 30 years and over those various contracts, do you ever remember a period or one of those contracts where there was such a decline in state receipts as we have experienced in the last 2 to 3, 4 years? And before you answer the question, let me explain what I'm getting to.
Okay.
So for most of that 30-year period, why the state always had more money year to year. So receipts by the state were always on the rise over those 30 years. However, in recent years, why it's been in the opposite direction. So that from that perspective, it's a completely different situation that existed over 20 or 30 years. And so being practical, when receipts are on the rise, it's one thing for the governor and the unions to negotiate and say, this is our agreement, but there is a difference when receipts are on the decline. Could you speak to that?
Yes, I certainly would. In fact, that's a very good point. And when Governors Ryan and Blagojevich were in office, and we had existing collective bargaining agreements, which we had negotiated with them, and came and asked us to reopen our contracts and make concessions, we said no. We don't believe it's justified. And there's always. I will say this: all the years I've been involved with state government, there's never been a real flush time. There's always money's always been, pretty much always been on the tight side, at least with respect to, for our members at least, people cried poverty. But at any rate, we didn't think that we didn't want to go down what we felt was a slippery slope when we felt there were, there were other ways of dealing with the problem. When we were approached by Governor Quinn, we did recognize exactly, this is, we're in a different, I don't want to say entirely different, but a much different situation. The fiscal situation was much more dire. And that's why we agreed to the concessions that we agreed to. Because we said, well, we understand that you, the state, have a fiscal problem. We'd have to be blind not to see that. So we did not once, but twice, 2 years running, we had wage increases that we were entitled to that we deferred. We also agreed to a voluntary furlough program. We also agreed to changes in our health care. We also helped the state identify other areas where we thought that the cost savings could be effectuated. So we recognize, believe me, we recognize that times are different. And we tried to be responsive to it. And I think, if you look, if you totaled up the number of dollars that our members, gave up, if you will, in order to address the state's problems, I think that, a fair-minded observer would say, well, state employees stepped up to the plate and helped out, even though they themselves are experiencing many of the problems that members of the legislature and other people who work for the state are experiencing. That is, we have people, child protective workers, who have $2,000 or $3,000 owed to them for their travel. They're going around trying to protect, and they have to wait months and months. I'm getting phone calls saying, I need new tires on my car, and I've got to go out and, and make sure this kid is protected. And our members are having, to wait the 3 or 4 months for that. We've had members call, they can't get treatment from their doctors or their dentists because the state is so late in paying. And so they have to wait months and months, or they have to pay up front. They have to pay up front and then wait for months for the state. So we recognize there is a problem, and I think if you looked at it, any fair-minded person would say that state employees have stepped up to the plate and have tried to help out.
So Henry, let me respond to 2 of your points and then come back to a third. So as part of your testimony, you talked in terms of working people not being responsible for the financial meltdown in the country, and I think that we all agree with you that working people for the state of Illinois were not responsible. There may have been some working people on Wall Street that were responsible. I don't think they're members of your union.
No, they're not. I don't know how hard they were working either, but
Well,
they weren't doing anything useful.
next, I think I speak for all the members of the committee. We do not want to replace the governor in the negotiations. We don't want to go to the negotiations and replace the governor on one side of the bargaining table. I think most members of the committee would say that they pretty much like you, but they don't want to spend that much time with you. Okay, I think they would say that. But we just don't want to replace the governor as the negotiator for the state. But I want to take you back on, now please help us, how do you define our role? What are we supposed to do? We're duly elected. One of our responsibilities under the Constitution is to adopt a balanced budget,
Right.
which means that under the Constitution, we're expected to be involved in budget making. Budget making is simply making allocation decisions. And to the best of our ability, having a real good understanding of what the cost will be, where there'll be increases in the cost in the future. I mean, it's really critical for the members of this
Right.
committee to know what we're supposed to do.
Well, again, I think, you're singling out collective bargaining agreements, and I'm not sure that it's only collective bargaining agreements that, if you will, impinge upon your flexibility. There are other contracts that the executive branch enters into that presumably the state then become a state responsibility for the state to pay for, or sometimes the legislature, if you will, binds itself. It says, well, if people meet certain standards, then they're going to get certain benefits, and then, maybe more people than you had anticipated because they need it, apply for the benefit, and the legislature is expected to fund it because it is something that people have a right to do. So I think in the same way, and there are a lot of things that require cooperation between the branches, between the executive branch and the legislative branch, and I would think, and as I know, and I think you know, in the past, there was dialogue very often between the executive branch and the legislative branch when it came to negotiating a contract. I can remember, I think I said this the other day, when governors would say to us, well, we don't think we can do that. We think that it would be looked upon, wouldn't be looked upon favorably by the General Assembly. So it's like, I guess it's partly you have to work that out with the executive branch exactly, to let them know what you feel and let them know that you want to be plugged in. It apparently worked successfully for 30 years.
Well, now, your last comment is precisely the intent of this resolution. Let us know where you're going with cost. That's what this resolution is all about. The resolution is not about repealing the collective bargaining statute. It's not about constraining participants in collective bargaining. It's all about having a handle on costs.
Well, I would, I think rather than saying, I would characterize it a little differently than you. Rather than saying, I think you said, we want to know where you're going with respect to bargaining. I think this says, I think that's what you said this says. This says, well, we want to know where you're going. And I think this says, no, here's where you're going. By setting, by setting a limit, you're saying, you're taking my job away from me, I'll get laid off. Say, well, this is where you're going, that's where it's going to end up, that's where it is, which is what it says. It says X percent, you haven't put the percent on yet, we can only speculate as to whatever it might be. And again, I just think, frankly, forgetting the dollars aside, I just think it's, frankly, not good public policy in terms of its impingement on the bargaining process. As it happened, this last year of our contract, there was a 4-year agreement, we were, scheduled for a nice pay increase. And that's what people have focused on. They didn't focus on the first year of this contract, when we got, in the middle of the year, 1.5%. So we got 0.75%. There were years in the past when we negotiated contracts that were zero. I'm ashamed to admit it, but there were years that there wasn't any money there, and we took a zero. Those years people forget about, and they look at the year when we did a little better. But as I said, the average over the time is a little over 3%. The annualized cost less because many of those were backloaded, if you will. We got more in the late years rather than the early years. So I just think it takes away the flexibility. The other thing is, frankly, you said an X amount, that's not only the governor might say that's the maximum, right? The legislature said X, that's the maximum. We're going to say, well, that's the minimum. Even, I don't know how low you might go with this percentage, but we're certainly, we might say, frankly, maybe we'd rather spend the money in some other way, but we're bound, people say, what do you mean you didn't get, Speaker Madigan was willing to give us X and you came back with X minus? What kind of negotiations is that?
In light of what you just said, maybe we'll bring the number down even further. And Henry, now you do know that this is the same idea that we imposed upon ourselves last spring in terms of the total budget.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, but that's it. You imposed it on yourself. You didn't impose it on us. And now you're...
Okay, but now again,
right.
It's our rule in budget making, and it's constitutionally provided. So thank you very much.
Well,